Like to welcome all of you to this special briefing focusing on the ongoing crisis in Jordan, particularly focusing on its political and economic implications. We have a panel of three people who have been in-house and outside, who have been focusing on events in Jordan for a while. Their bios are in the flyer that you have been given, or the document you have been given regarding the event today. So I will not introduce them in detail. But let me say a few words about the topic itself and kind of set the pace for the presentations and the ensuing discussion, the Q&A afterwards. As we speak today, a new government today has been sworn in Jordan. Prime Minister designate, who's now Prime Minister, I guess, as of this afternoon, Omar Razaz, has submitted his cabinet list to the king. Somewhat of a technocratic cabinet, 28 members, with very few remnants from the previous cabinet. Some of the key positions I noticed, just like the foreign minister, for example, Ayman Safadi is still on board, but most of the cabinet has been shuffled with a lot of technocratic, if you will, and technical experience to try to, as promised, to meet, if you will, the nature of the crisis. One thing that attracted my attention this morning, this is probably one of the most progressive cabinets I've seen in the Arab world. 7 women, 7 cabinet members, including some senior cabinet positions, not kind of like nominal, house cleaning, so to speak, positions. So I think it's impressive that you see all these capable, well-educated, well-equipped women to kind of help confront this, what is essentially a socio-economic and political crisis at the same time. The other point I would like to make is bring your attention to the Mecca summit that just took place this past weekend, and with the participation and by the invitation, of course, of the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, and the Emiratis, where they became concerned, out of their concern for, if you will, the potential damage or collapse, economically at least, of Jordan. They moved rather quickly and pledged $2.5 billion to Jordan. As an aid package, a kind of diverse aid package that deserves some explanation, or maybe a little bit of a more serious examination than what has been portrayed in the media. Is this really like 2.5 billion cash to the Jordanian economy to help it recover from this crisis, or is it mostly deposits in the National Bank of Jordan and other things? My guess, in looking at the numbers, the actual benefit to Jordan to overcome this crisis will not exceed 150 to 300 max, $300 million annually to help defray or take care of the crisis. The rest is going to be mostly symbolic gesture to kind of embolden, if you will, the regime or the kingdom to try to move forward in this crisis. And of course, I would like to invite our panelists to also take a look at why now, why all of a sudden these same Gulf countries that are so concerned, and they have been traditionally close to Jordan, why all of a sudden concerned? Aren't they the same countries that canceled their aid package 15, 16 months ago of $3.5 billion? So why it was okay to cancel it, that Jordan didn't deserve it 16 months ago, and all of a sudden it's in desperate need right now. We need to extend an equal, if you will, relatively speaking, amount. And of course, yesterday you probably have seen on the news the third, I would say, event that I would like to bring to your attention is the Deputy Prime Minister of Qatar and Foreign Minister of Qatar, Sheikh Mohammed Al Thani, met with the King, and he added a donation from Qatar for $500 million added to the 2.4, including, which is, I think, probably most significant in the whole package, including 10,000 actual jobs offered to Jordanians in Qatar if they would like to go work there, which would probably be more direct and more meaningful to the current employment crisis in Jordan than any of the others. Now, in terms of general questions, I mean, in looking at the crisis and trying to analyze it and understand it as an observer of Middle East politics and particularly Arab-Israeli and Jordan also included, I kind of, agree with those analysts that have written extensively over the past 10 days over the fact that this is an economic crisis. But at the same time, we're all aware, I mean, most of you in this room have some expertise, if not all of you, on Jordan. And you know that this is not new. Jordan has had many economic crises. As a matter of fact, I would say 4 major ones in the last 6 years. So this is not new at all. And what distinguishes this one? Most people keep saying that this time it looks different. What does it mean, it looks different or smells different than in the past? You know, they refer to the makeup of the demonstrators. They refer to the fact that a wider cross-section of Jordanians participated or endorsed the protests. They pointed out the fact that younger people were involved this time beyond just the traditional labor unions and other professional unions. They talked about the gender participation being higher, particularly younger women participating in these demonstrations and so on. So do you guys see a difference this time than previous economic crises? Number 2, is this crisis motivated by the same traditional problems that we or Jordan faced in the past? Are we talking about the traditional lack of resources, natural resources in Jordan, dependence on foreign aid and assistance, the high rate percentage-wise of the national debt versus the GDI or the GDP, the standard of living rising so fast, the fact that Amman has become probably the most or one of the top most expensive cities in the region, yet the income is way below average for the Arab world. Is the standard of living rising so fast being of impact on this crisis? And to what extent do you assign blame to the failure of successive governments in Jordan to basically respond to these crises in the past, and including this one? It seems to me that Jordanian governments, successive ones, have been better at crisis management than at resolving the inherent issues or difficulties that contributed to previous crises. And the quickness and the insensitivity with which they began, probably under pressure, one could say fairly, Joe, if you want to kind of deal with that too, the issue of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, pressuring Jordan to reform in a certain way and raise taxes so fast and expand, if you will, the base of taxpayers in Jordan from the current 4.5% paying taxes in Jordan to the 10%. That's more than doubling. So a lot more people have to pay a lot more taxes than experienced by the Jordanian citizenry in the past. But beyond that, I personally, since the beginning of this crisis, have been from this school of thought that believes this is not only an economic crisis. I really believe this time there is a real serious political crisis happening in the region that has touched Jordan maybe before, prematurely, before other countries. And that is the change in the strategic kind of mindset in the region. All these conflicts we have witnessed over the past few years are coming home to roost. And Jordan has played a key role in these conflicts. If you talk about Syria, if you talk about Iraq before that, if you talk about Palestine historically, Jordan has been at the core of these problems, a key player, and has made itself of importance to countries who are trying to determine and control these crises from the outside, including the United States, including some of the Gulf states, and henceforth that importance of Jordan. Can Jordan be Jordan again? Can Jordan remain Jordan today in light of these changes? If the Syrian conflict is indeed diminishing in value and ending, what's going to be the role of Jordan? What's going to happen to almost 1 million Syrians right now burdening, if you will, quote unquote, the economy of Jordan? Iraq, the same thing. If Iraq is turning into a democracy, as some people think, and elections may be working, they haven't been yet, but they're being contested, and a lot of the votes have been burned this week. But if they are recounted and we move forward, what's going to happen to the several 100,000 Iraqis that are still living in Jordan, part and parcel of the Jordanian economy? And of course, the traditional question, Palestine. You know, you get a very high percentage of the Jordanian population. Some people say, you know, close to 2/3. Some people say a little bit less. Anyway, let's say between 40 and 60%. What's going to happen now with this threatened deal of the century that the team is heading to the Middle East the next few days to sell to different countries, including Jordan? And how is that going to impact the role of Jordan in that? And how is that going to impact the largest Palestinian population, refugee population that's outside of Palestine that happens to be in Jordan? So these are the issues, the challenges that we face today in this panel, and I hope that the panelists, beginning with Aaron, and then go to Joe, and then Imad, will focus on from their different perspectives. And again, the bios are in the flyer you were given as you came in. And once they are finished with their 10-minute to 12-minute presentations each, we'll go ahead and have a 30-minute Q&A session to give you a chance to interact with the speakers. So welcome again. And Aaron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Khalil, very much for this invitation. I've attended many events here at the Arab Center. I'm sitting in where you are, so it's an honor really to be, and I've learned so much. It's an honor to be on this side today. So I'm going to be speaking in general about the political and regional elements of this conflict. But before we do that, I think it's really important to emphasize the economic ones. Because when you speak to Jordanians in the past week or 2 weeks or even month or past 2 months, they're really hurting right now. The economic challenges are great. So I'm just going to throw out some numbers just for everyone to get a quantifiable understanding. So fuel prices have risen 5 times over the course of 2018. Bread prices have doubled. You have unemployment about 18% according to the official stats. Now people don't think that that's actually the real number. It's probably much higher. And certainly in the periphery, in places like Qadak and Mafraq, it's even higher. Now Amman is one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive city in the Arab world. And you have an average monthly wage of about $650. So for many Jordanians who are working, and they are working, whether at a government job or not at a government job, they just can't make the month. And that's kind of what is the real trigger for a lot of these protests. And when we think about the larger geostrategic, we talk about Saudi Arabia, we talk about Palestine, we talk about the king. I think it's really important for everyone to remember what it is for the average Jordanian in Mafraq, the average Jordanian in Amman, or wherever else, because that's really the cause of this turmoil. I have a PowerPoint, because it might get a little boring to be looking at me for 10 minutes. I know it's structured a bit weird with it behind. But I think some of the pictures that come out of these protests are really amazing and quite inspiring. So that's one of them. The protests were incredible. Just as people were mentioning, you had a very large female participation in addition to men. You had people from the youth You had people from across the country, the different governments. And one of the most important, if not the most important element of the protest is how overwhelmingly peaceful they were. And you have people they have significant frustrations, but they did not resort to violence. They were peaceful at the same time. OK, so this is a cartoon by Imad K that I think really kind of speaks to how many Jordanians feel. That's the former Prime Minister Mulki. He's holding on to, with dear life, the tax law, even though he's kind of drowning in the midst of popular anger. And to many Jordanians, they view him as an utter failure because he was willing to kind of put the tax law above their welfare, and he wasn't willing to, even despite significant popular protests, he wasn't willing to abandon it. So that's kind of how many Jordanians saw the situation. I think it's a lot more complex, but it's important to put that perspective out there. OK, this graph is really, really important because I think this is the cause of every single thing that's happening. This is the public debt. So as you can see, the beginning of the Arab Spring, Jordan was doing OK. It wasn't thriving. This is not Singapore anywhere. But at the same time, it was manageable. You can see in between 2011 and 2016, you have the debt spiraling up to nearly $40 billion, which is 95% of the GDP. You have these massive economic structural flaws that's happening right now. So you have the debt. That's one indicator. You have over a third of the population working for the government. So you have very little private sector growth that's happening, and the government is basically just funding the entire population. Some people say it's 1/3. I saw from Taylor Luck, a very well-respected journalist in Jordan, who said it's 55% working for the government. Depends on how you calculate it. But that's just not a sustainable model when you don't have oil. And Jordan has no oil. So that's really important to emphasize. And then Khalil mentioned, which is really important, only 5% are paying income tax. So you have this combination that's just not going to work in a country like Jordan that's so resource poor. And Prime Minister Mulki saw all these indicators and saw if we continue down this path that was really started by former Prime Minister Abdel Nasser, who was Prime Minister for 4 years during when the debt spiraled, Jordan was going to go completely insolvent. Not going to be able to pay their debts. It's going to turn up like Greece or even worse. So what Prime Minister Mulki did is he, as you can see, unfortunately 2018 isn't on this graph, but he really stopped the bleeding. So instead of the public debt increasing about 5% according to its GDP every single year, he basically flatlined it. And how did he do that? It's by some of these very painful economic measures, by removing the subsidies on bread, fuel, et cetera, and by trying to expand the tax base. So The Economist, this is not popular in Amman, this is not popular in Mafraq, but they called former Prime Minister Mulki one of the most pro-reform prime ministers in Jordanian history. Because he was willing to do measures that were extremely unpopular. He probably knew he was going to get kicked out eventually, but he knew that if he didn't do something dramatic, Jordan was going to go bankrupt. So I think it's really important for us to note that when people call for the new prime minister to make dramatic reforms have already happened. OK. Now, it's helpful to look at the understanding of the regime, how they see these protests at the time. So on May 30th is when the first massive general strike began. And it was really kind of an earth-shattering event in Amman, across the country. Everybody felt it. You couldn't ignore it. Many people were participating. It was the topic of conversation on social media. And then this is Al-Ra'i newspaper, the government-owned newspaper in Jordan. And how do they portray the events the next day? They have a picture of the king and the queen hugging people, visiting different centers or whatever else. And then you have Hazem, who's a public transportation enthusiast. He wrote on Twitter, Danao is not just a river in Egypt. So I think when Jordan kind of thinks about how they're going to respond to crises in the future, this kind of operation just is not convincing in the 21st century. In the age of social media, trying to pretend that massive strikes, that massive economic woes don't exist, this is not going to sell really anything. So they really have to think going forward, what is going to be their PR message, because this is just not effective. OK, this is one of the more beautiful parts about the protests. is the fact that it was so peaceful, and the fact that you have kids. This kid is offering the security forces a snack. A lot of these protests were at night because it's during Ramadan right now, so people are protesting very late at night. It's certainly not an easy assignment for the security forces because they have to be up all night and then prepare during the day, et cetera. And you had a lot of protesters kind of understanding that challenge for the security forces because, unfortunately, Jordan has such a large percentage of the population working in the security forces, so kind of everybody knows a brother, a cousin, an uncle who works for them, so they were trying to help them out. You saw people cleaning the streets after demonstrations. You had them giving out candy. You had sharing meals, iftars, et cetera. So I think it was a really kind of special, in contrast to the really bloody nature that you've seen protests in Syria and Egypt, this was really, in general, a much nicer kind of atmosphere. But at the same time, I don't want to be completely whitewashing everything that's happening. This is also kind of scenes that you did see. Security forces, this is in Amman near the Fourth Circle during kind of the peak of the protests. But you can see this was not the typical scene, but this did happen as well. So it's important to get that balance that the security forces were forcibly dispersing demonstrators at different points of the protests. Okay, so now let's move on from the economic element to the political one. So this is a poll done by IRI in 2017. It says, did the current parliament accomplish anything for which you think it should be praised for? So we're in the purple right now, all the way on the right. So a whopping 2% said yes. 89% said no, 9% says I don't know, not sure, I'm kind of confused how those 9% could even exist. But there's deep distrust towards the Jordanian parliament, but just in terms of political apparatus in general. And one comment that I saw on social media that I think was particularly compelling was the idea of it's dangerous to go to full taxation with limited representation. So what Jordan's trying to do is trying to ramp up the taxes in order to sustain itself. But at the same time, it's doing that by not having any democratic process. The prime ministers are continuously appointed, et cetera. So I didn't realize how long this was going to take, so I'm going to have to speed through the rest of my speech. But just take it from here. So who is Omar Azaz? He's a new prime minister, Harvard-educated, MIT professor, well-respected by many. At the same time, the Military Veterans Association criticized him very harshly, and some Jordanians who said, we're looking for a change, yet this new prime minister was a former minister in the government, in addition to the fact that he was a former World Bank official. So if we're trying to oppose the World Bank, and now we get a World Bank official as prime minister, that's kind of a weird dynamic. Now, this is a cartoon that's very popular, the changing of the prime ministers. You have the different heads of Mulki and Omar Azaz, but at the same time, the body is the same. Many Jordanians see this is the 7th prime minister in 7 years. They've seen this show before. They're not convinced. And then you have the Prime Minister Azaz responding to average citizens on Twitter. Many Jordanians like this. They see him as much more accessible than the former prime minister. This is an important point that often gets disregarded. This is a bit provocative what I'm going to be saying right now. It's certainly not what you're going to hear in Jordan. But King Abdullah was absent for the first 3 days of the protests. So this is June 1st. He was in a conference in Europe. Now, these protests were not, people knew about what was happening. They were planned in advance. And the fact that the kings decided to still stay abroad 3 days into why didn't he come back on May 30th, May 31st, only June 1st, late at night, kind of says something. Amman.net had done various reports that the king of Jordan is absent from the country about 25% of the year. And then just some things to think about. If there have been 7 prime ministers in 7 years, who is appointing these prime ministers? The king. So if everything fails, does the king also have some responsibility for appointing people who are so inefficient, so ineffective? That's one. The king stepped in to freeze the fuel tax on Friday of the protests. So if he has the power to suspend some taxes, why isn't he suspending other taxes? The idea that the king deserves credit for saving everything that good happens in Jordan, but then none of the blame for when everything bad happens, that just doesn't seem very compelling in the 21st century. And I think more Jordanians, while they might not be able to say that, they kind of feel that. Now, in terms of the neighboring countries, Saudi Arabia is very important to this. If you could just tell me one minute. Because they're a neighboring country. Why did they give the money? Because they don't want to see instability on their border. Think about how much they've invested in Yemen. billions upon billions of dollars because of instability on their border. Jordan, a fellow monarchy, they would not be interested in that. You have Bahrain, the foreign minister attacking Al Jazeera on Twitter for fueling the protests. I think it's a bit of a childish response, attacking the media instead of realizing why these protests happen. Israel is certainly interested in the continuation of King Abdullah. Jordan is one of 2 countries that has a peace treaty with Israel. Jordan would be very concerned about instability in their border. And then finally, the US and Russia maintain both strong security ties to the state. I'm just going to finish. Unfortunately, I didn't time everything correctly. This will just be my last point. But the challenges facing Prime Minister Razaz. That's King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia with the 8th summit. So the Prime Minister has major challenges. The debt is spiraling. How do you deal with it? On the one hand, you can deal with it by cutting expenses. So one of the main expenses is government employment. So you have over a third of the population working for the government. But if he does that, then you're going to see massive riots because these people, if they're working for the government, they don't really have 21st century skills to work in Dubai or anything else. So they're going to be unemployed. So that's one option, but it's a really difficult option. Number 2, he could expand the tax base and increase taxes. But we've seen that option by former Prime Minister Mulki, and the response by the protesters has been really negative. So the message from the people to the Prime Minister is if you expand the tax base, we're going to protest. So how is the current Prime Minister going to really be able to lower the public debt if any measure he does is going to be so vehemently opposed by the public and eventually lead to his kicking out from the position? So Prime Minister Razaz said this a few days ago. There are no magic solutions here. The reason we've gotten here is because successive failures by different Jordanian governments, even though some governments did better than others. But if anyone's looking for an easy fix, and my last recommendation would be, is if Jordan wastes this opportunity and does none of the structural changes that need to be done to Jordan's economy and just waits to another protest in 2 years or 3 years, the people eventually will not be sufficient in calling for the downfall of the Prime Minister. Eventually, they're going to say who really is responsible for this entire mess. And I think that's an important fact to consider as well.
Thank you, Aaron. That was an excellent presentation. We move forward to kind of go a little bit deeper in some of the economic aspects of the crisis. On our own colleague, Joe Macaron, will be leading this part of the discussion. Joe?
Yes, thank you, Khalil. I just want to take a little bit step back from this lot of social media analysis just to put the Jordanian latest protest in a context. I mean, since its independence, Jordan has faced 4 challenges, which continue to shape what's happening now, which is the demographic, the resources, the geography, and the legitimacy of the monarchy itself. So Jordan perfected the scenario when nations change, save yourself. So they always manage to reinvent their geopolitical role, but at the same time to still follow the same economic prescription and the same policies in the last decades. So before I go into the recent events, the dynamics and the role of the IMF, and what should we watch for in the coming period, I just want to touch quickly on those challenges. First, the demography and the geography. There's an old saying that Jordan is caught between Iraq and hard place, and this is the reality of Jordanian regional policies. They had to always deal and address or deal with the challenges around them. And there was 4 major regional events that continue to impact Jordan economic policy. In 1967, they lost the West Bank. It was 1/3 of the Jordanian economy. This led to refugees. And this led to the dynamic we know between the East Bank Jordanians and the Palestinians and the Jordanians of Palestinian origin. We have the 1983 when the oil boom ended. And then we had suddenly to deal with the crisis, which I'll address later. And then we had 2003 when Jordan lost a major trading partner in Iraq. And this also created the Iraqi refugees issue. And we had also 2011, which created the Syrian refugee crisis and 10 billion addition of cost just to deal with the refugee. The second is the legitimacy and resources. the monarchy, since the independence, they had some sort of rentier system. Even the king, when he became ruler of Transjordan, he had 5,000 British pounds basically to rule. And this also continued over the time. King Hussein, this is how he somehow built political support, that the East Bank Jordanians had the jobs of the security and the government. And you have the wealthy Jordanian of Palestinian origin who was control of the bank. And you have the tribal, also the East Bank tribal, who part of their loyalty to the Jordan is this system somehow that keeps the legitimacy of the Jordanian government. So the government or the monarchy tried to sustain all these pillars of power at home by adapting to these regional challenges. So I believe the roots of this crisis now goes back to 1989, not anything else. Since successive governments since 1989 tried basically to avoid the difficult decision of cutting the sizable public sector. 14% of Jordanian jobs are part of the public sector. So in 1999, King Hussein sold a third of the gold reserves, but he didn't want to cut salaries or size of the government. So since 1989, the IMF here, we can add it in the game, joined in basically the conversation. And you had protests in 1998 that intersected with an IMF agreement. We had the same in 1996, we had the same in 2012, and we have now last week, 2018. So the main question is how to address, how basically to be able to move beyond this structural problem without harming these pillars of powers. So when the question with the IMF, I mean, what will happen now, I think it's a big question. Now, Razas came to power, he has a big fan base at the IMF. He knows how to talk to them. He's a big champion of basically mitigating the fiscal reforms on the lower income. So what will happen now is a repeat scenario, that the government steps in, contain the public anger, remove the prime minister. Mulki had done a good economic reform at some point. And they will ask the IMF to basically for a grace period of 1 year or two. There'll be a national dialogue which is belated to try to contain the public anger. And we're gonna go back maybe in the same cycle in a few years if nothing happens. So the Razas government gonna focus on structuring debt, developments, and try basically to freeze any fiscal reform in the coming period. Now the Gulf aid is back. The Gulf aid historically funded the public sector in Jordan, the expanding Gulf. Now it's coming back in that sense. If they really follow through on the aid, because those are just pledges. There's nothing they can just not go through if there was, Saudi, Jordanian tension in that sense. So the constraints for the new government are the same like the last one. First, the lack of the IMF to understand the socio-political context of Jordan. And this is a major issue. Second, the Jordanian cabinet has a limited mandate. They cannot, the last one had a lot of bickering inside it. It came on the premise of economic reform. The king, in his announcement of the Mulki government, said there was need for economic reforms. Now, obviously, there's a shift. And the third part is the lack of the legislative accountability. The protest went on the street because the parliament didn't do their job in basically reviewing the state budget. And when I was at the IMF, this was a big issue because we did the training for those parliamentarians, Jordanian parliamentarians, in different stages. And I remember at dinner, one of them was telling me, we don't have the budget staff to read the budget. We don't read it. And they acknowledge this. And it's a challenge, because there are limited resources. There's inability, basically, the government, to the parliament, to play this role, to avoid the issue to go down for the streets like it happened now. So those who went on the street had a very clear message that if the government wants to increase revenue, they should go to the regime base, which is the tribal East Bank or the wealthy banks, not for us. Those are the younger, middle, low-income class who are not part of the rentier system. And they say we want to be the casualties of the economic reform. That should be more louder discussion. And those are who went to the street. Those are the new discovery of the last protest. So and to start to conclude, I mean, it's fair to say that Jordan had a lot of problems the last 15 years. And one should not underestimate, I mentioned before. And there's a vibrating private sector, but there's this restructuring issue that they need to be addressed at some point. It was mentioned before, the 14 billion debt, all the economic challenges that were widely known. So the government wants to continue, or the monarchy to continue the same level of expenses despite the geopolitical factor. So, and Jordan doesn't have a sustainable revenue that can basically help the government survive. They always have to look for foreign aid. Since the 60s, a third at least of government revenues is coming from aid. So I want to conclude with 6 main points of what impact will have those protests on Jordan. The first impact is the impact on the IMF. They will be not able now to push for benchmarks, push for reforms. They have to step back. It's a very difficult decision. I know it's at least inside the IMF. They have always a perception issue that they don't care about the poor. So now this image is back somehow. And the monarchy looked as if they were saving the protesters from the IMF recommendation. So this is going to change the dynamic. The second, we have to watch what this crisis will have on the return of Syrian refugees. The government has been a little bit not sure what to do. Now, basically, there'll be more talking about basically some sort of return should happen, at least incremental, so that's going to impact, because 25% of the government budget goes to refugees. So this is going to be a big challenge. We have to see how the government, especially the Razaz government, will deal with it. Third is the energy crisis. Most of the Jordanian debt comes from energy. 2011, the Arab gas pipeline was damaged. Jordan shifted after to natural gas. Now they had to sign a deal with Israel through a U.S. company to avoid public pressure. So there's a lot of challenges in the energy moving forward. I don't want to go into details of them now. And the last point is the government calculation now is we need to get past 2019. The Nasib border with Syria going to open. The Basra, Aqaba oil pipeline and trade route going to open. Conflict going to go down. So maybe we'll have some breathing space, 2018, 2019, and then we can, recover in 2020. And the sixth point, the fifth point is the Jordan Balancing Act. The Jordanian has been in the last few years doing a really balancing act of foreign policy that's very difficult to manage. And this is reminding me of 1989. King Hussein had to go to a peace treaty with Israel that changed the political dynamic. Before that, he had to pay the price of standing with Saddam on the invasion of Kuwait. King Abdullah II learned this lesson. 2003, 2005, Saudi Arabia came and replaced the Iraqi oil. So now, if this oil really comes through, Jordania is going to be more flexible, less controversial on foreign policy. And the last concluding idea is, I heard a lot when discussed that linking the Arab Spring to what's happening in Jordan. I don't think it's linked. I don't think it's going to evolve. This is what we're going through is a vicious cycle since 1989. There's nothing new. There's nothing a game changer, but there's some section of society that's speaking up. So the question is, the government going to have a breathing space now, a year or two. Will it exploit it to basically restructure the economy and change the dynamics? I highly doubt it, but I hope Razaz will have his chance.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. Excellent remarks. Imad.
Yes, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. However serious the domestic environment is, and it's definitely very, very, very serious, it really does not dwarf what Jordan is really going through regionally, obviously. There are basically at least 4 different circles within which Jordan operates, whether it is, I always operate on the principle of foreign policy is originates in domestic politics. So you want to conduct a certain foreign policy, you have to really know how your domestic politics are taking place. So there are basically four different circles. Jordan basically cannot escape its geography, obviously. The first one is basically the idea of Jordan's relationship with the Palestinian issue, or the Palestine cause. Jordan is responsible for what happens to Jerusalem, and basically, given how weak the Palestinian leadership is regarding Jerusalem and the entire Palestine cause, Jordan is relied upon as a line of defense, so to speak, to what happens to Jerusalem. So Jordan is being pulled and pushed in different directions, considering, number one, considering the United States patron of Jordanian policy towards the Palestinian issue. I mean, there has been a lot of talk about the Trump administration pressuring the Jordanians and actually letting Jordan suffer a little bit, so maybe Jordan would be softened up a little bit to accept a certain deal on Jerusalem, the deal of the century. So the accusation is still there, although yesterday I think the Congress probably approved a budget of probably like $1.5 billion of assistance, U.S. assistance to Jordan, which is good, but this assistance does not go without strings attached, obviously, and the major tranche of this assistance is basically security and issues that have to related to security, and primarily the security of the State of Israel, because Jordan has been a first line of defense for that kind of security. The second circle is obviously going on in Syria right now, and whether the Syrian civil war winds down or escalates. There are anywhere between 600,000, these are the UN figures, and 1 million Syrian refugees in Jordan, and this is definitely a huge cost, obviously, on the Jordanian government, but yet at the same time, it brings with it a lot of security challenges to the Jordanian government. What's going on today is the Syrian president is threatening that he is going to retake the south from the opposition there, and if it does do that, Jordan will definitely be affected by what goes on, including and not limited to a new influx of yet more refugees who will have nowhere else to go except cross the border to Jordan. The third circle is basically Jordan is Jordan is affected by what happens between its Gulf neighbors, between what's going on today in GCC and the GCC crisis, and the boycott of Qatar by Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE and Egypt. Jordan really suffers from that. Jordan as the typical rentier state. I mean, although it doesn't have a specific kind of, it's not an oil economy, it's not a gas economy, but it really depends for a lot of its economic well-being on rents. And the GCC countries have been providers of aid to Jordan, but that aid, lately that aid cannot come without any strings attached, unfortunately. The GCC crisis of June 2017 has forced Jordan to really take sides. The problem is Jordan did not take sides, and this is probably one of those things that is really needs to be decided one way or the other, because apparently the Saudi-led coalition is not satisfied with just standing on the sidelines. You have to be with us or against us, and Jordan is suffering from that. At the same time, Jordan did not necessarily abandon the Saudis or the Emiratis, and did not necessarily really go against Qatar, although the Al Jazeera office was closed in Amman, and the Jordanians did not pronounce themselves to be totally against the crisis, but yet at the same time they did not side with Qatar either. The final circle is basically the involvement in terrorism, the issue of terrorism, this idea of the war on terror and Jordan to be a player in this war on terror has a lot of baggage. If Jordan is to really participate in this global war on terror, Jordan does not have the facilities, or the facilities as in financial facilities, instruments of supplying what is needed for a really vigorous war on terror. And this has really affected how Jordan deals with the international community, specifically the United States. But generally speaking, the issue of terrorism has a lot to do, of tentacles, so to speak. We're talking about, is it terrorism in general against, the ISIS type of terrorism, or is it terrorism against Israel, or is it terrorism against the Arab monarchical order? But the idea is Jordan as a counterterrorism, as a pillar of the counterterrorism fight, is a fight that has to do a lot with whether it is a stable monarchy or not a stable monarchy. And this is something that Jordan has played, but yet at the same time, at the price of domestic stability. We also have to remember that there have been a lot of attacks within Jordan itself by jihadi-inspired elements, and Jordan did participate in the fight against the Islamic State. And as a matter of fact, one of its pilots was shot down and was unfortunately burned alive. So there are a lot of all of these things are going to affect and will always affect Jordan's situation. The problem with this whole thing is the confluence of all these circles of influence on Jordanian foreign policy is that Jordan will remain, as long as it is poor from a resource basis, will always be dependent on rent. And this is definitely going to be affecting how it really conducts its foreign policy. I think that's
Thank you, Imad, and thanks to all three panelists for focusing on quite a few, actually, if not all, the questions that I have raised in my introductory remarks. And your presentations were very complimentary in terms of some of the issues that you raised. For example, I like the four circles that Imad just used to kind of summarize, if you will, the challenge that is faced by Jordan and how that pours directly into the managing these four circles is a heck of a balancing act. As Joe referred to earlier, and so appreciate all presentation. Now we will open the floor for questions and answers. Please go ahead and write your questions on the cards in front of you, and just raise your card and staff will pick it up and bring it over. Let me start with the first question until we get some more cards. None of you mentioned the issue of kind of a simple issue that was raised earlier in the crisis, the tax avoidance, which every country suffers from. I've heard an expert in Jordan say that Jordan right now is really, to survive this crisis economically, it's in need of about $700 million annually. That's where the shortage is. And he said, about 800 million are every year unpaid taxes. That's what Jordan is facing. If we do, just without doing anything else to mess up the economic system or raise taxes, if we could collect taxes a little bit better than we have done in the past, we would probably be raising 100 million more than what we need to break even. It could be an oversimplification, but I don't know if any of you would like to comment on that. And is this, or somebody, I mean, there are several of you in the audience who know this issue very well, if you would like to comment on the, whether this is a reasonable expectation.
I mean, it's reasonable on paper, but how to implement it on the ground? The Murki government raised, the IMF benchmark was to raise 630 million from direct or indirect tax. In 2017, the Murki government secured that. There was another expectation to do it in 2018. This is why the income tax law came. And this is where the reaction. The Jordanians, at least the one who protested, believe, as I said in my presentation, that the regime base who profit directly from the regulatory system should be the one taking the taxes, not them. And this is the vicious cycle of political loyalty in return for not paying taxes, which is a problem not only in Jordan, across the Arab world, that people are not adjusted to the idea of paying taxes. You have 60%, 70% of water in Jordan that's either being theft or basically being misused or leaked. So there are a lot of places where this money is running out. And the government, because they somehow, between quotations, spoiled the citizen in that sense in the 80s. And this is why I think the monarchy at some point should have clear, open conversation with the people that these levels of economic dynamics are not sustainable, that there should be difficult discussions for Jordan basically to become less dependent on aid and more vibrant as an economy. And the tax issue is one of this conversation.
Please.
On the issue of taxes, there is this fantasy in the Arab world that taxes are very low. If you take taxes to be a percentage that the government receives from GDP, the Arab world, with the new taxes that have been added and the new one proposed in Jordan, is now among the highest tax regions.
That's correct.
Ranging to about 30 to 35%. In Jordan itself, the average tax as a percent of GDP that the government collects is about 23%. Taxes in Jordan is about 23% of GDP. It's reasonable. It's
Yeah, but
it's on.
It's
Can you hear me?
indirect tax.
Sorry. It's indirect tax, but plus direct taxes, but it's the same thing. It's the same measure. The U.S. direct and indirect taxes for the federal government is about 18% of GDP. So 23% is not an under-taxed region if you do that. So I don't think taxes and the collection of taxes is the issue. The issue is the structural model of the economy of Jordan, as many of you have talked about.
Okay, Mohammed, you want to add something to that? Could you pass the microphone over there, please?
Let me say from personal experience in dealing with Jordan, the tax evasion and even the playing with under-invoicing, all kinds of schemes in order not to pay taxes, it's very big, very high. I know I don't have many customers in Jordan now because all of them, before even they order anything, they want to know if you are going to under-invoice, meaning if a bill is $100,000, they want you to put it as $50,000 in order to avoid paying taxes to the government. Furthermore, I had one customer, even though now I don't go to Jordan, he owed the company $75,000. He would not pay. I went to Jordan. He came to the hotel with a bag, $75,400. I said, I'm not going to do money laundering for you. He said, no, I'm paying you for whatever. I said, okay, but when I go back to America, I'm going to declare it. He said, are they going to tell my government? I said, I don't care. I'm going to tell my government that you're paying me cash that you are hiding from the government, not paying taxes. So tax evasion is a major issue, not in Jordan, all over the Arab world. And if we don't get, all of us in the Arab world, if we don't get over this, we'll continue to go around looking for somebody to give us a handout.
Thank you. Let's start with, go ahead. Did you turn in a question? If you have a question, please.
No, she wants to comment.
Yeah, okay, please, go ahead.
Thank you. Marissa Khurma, I'm a non-resident fellow at New America Foundation and a former public servant from Jordan. I think beyond the tax evasion conversation, particularly with the middle class that went down to the street this time, is basically the services that they're not getting. So that particular class is paying for private schools, for private healthcare, and they cannot afford to further pay income tax because they're not getting the services. So that's where the discontent is also adding to the situation. The other point is that according to a study, I think it was a 2010 estimate, 44% of the economy or of employment is informal. And that informal employment or this informal economy is basically not taxed. So yes, the government can be very creative at trying to restructure, but this is not solely a tax conversation. It is a matter of structuring the economy, and that's why the conversation is turning to, well, let's discuss a new social contract. This is the language that Omar Razaz is using, and he's opening it up with dialogue and inclusion and a participatory approach. So if anything is going to change, is it at least the approach towards something new to expect from the new government. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The first question we have here on cards is from Nissan, Voice of America, addressed to Imad. Will Jordan resort, as a result of all this discussion, to make a deal with the Syrian regime to open, if you will, the outlet, the crossing between the two countries to prevent more refugees from entering the country? Is that going to be an issue?
Well, I think the answer to this is more confusing than anything, really. For one thing, Jordan has never really had an antagonistic relationship with the Syrian regime, the present Syrian regime. Jordan has never really used its territory to really attack the present Syrian regime. But yet at the same time, it has borne the burden of the refugees from across the border. Whether it opens its border or does not open its border, the issue is not opening the border. The issue is what is beyond the border in Syria itself. For instance, if there is trade exchanges and things of that nature, will that trade really be safe on Syrian territory without the Syrian regime taking over that area and imposing its own condominium on it? So it's more complicated than actually whether Jordan opens up to the Syrian regime or not. It has more to do with the dynamics of the civil war itself that's going on. Daraa province in the south and Qunaitar province in the southeast are really serious places for that the Syrian regime is really trying to take over. We also do not want to discount the importance of the Israeli factor here. Will Jordan want to play a role in trying to protect Israeli security as well from the Syrian civil war or not? So it's really more complicated than just opening a corridor.
Yeah, Joe, I know you've been doing some research for
Yeah.
us at the center on this. Would you like to add something?
First, the Jordanian authorities took a decision that they're not allowing more Syrian refugees to come in. This is settled. The second issue is they are refusing to open the Nassim border unless the Syrian regime is on the other side. This is why they didn't open, even though it's a basic economic gateway for them. So I think they are waiting for the deals between US and Russia, whatever, to basically avoid a conflict that maybe the opposition will accept eventually to surrender the Nasib border for the region.
This one is addressed to all. Aaron, if you'd like to take a jab at it, from Paul Tyson's regarding the long-term solution to the refugee issues in Jordan, to the refugees in Jordan.
Okay. I think two of my panelists would probably be better able to deal with the long-term refugee analysis. I think we're falling into a trap of looking at Jordan's economy based on foreign policy, and the structural woes are internal. So for example, a lot of people are talking about Palestine as if Palestine is the reason for Jordan's conflict. So Jordan opposed, yes, the US embassy transfer. But at the same time, the United States former Secretary Tillerson came to Amman and signed an MOU in February after Jordan strongly opposed it, increasing US aid to Jordan to record levels.
That's why he's no longer in office.
And as you guys mentioned, the Congress just passed that into law. So if Palestine were really the reason why Jordan was being threatened, they would be receiving less aid from the United States, not more from the Trump administration. So that's one point. Number two is a lot of people are connecting it to Saudi Arabia with Palestine. Saudi Arabia cut off aid approximately in January, February of 2017. And people are connecting this to the deal of the century. This is way before there was any talk of whatever Kushner and Greenblatt are going to do. So when you see these economic woes, it's easy and it's kind of like sexy to say, oh, everything's about Palestine, foreign policy, Syria, etc. But these economic woes are based on a decade, if not more, of mismanagement, of corruption, of bloated public sector that really go beyond Palestine. And Syria is, people talk about refugees. Ayman Safadi went on CNN recently and he talked about the fact that the world has abandoned Jordan on the refugee issue. So Jordan receives record levels from the United States, way more than Lebanon and Turkey, even though Lebanon and Turkey have far more refugees than Jordan. Jordan receives double the amount of development aid than Afghanistan and Haiti does. So Jordan is getting way more from the international community for its refugees, despite some of its very problematic policies on refugees. For example, deporting Palestinian refugees, preventing them from Syria to come into the country. They've deported lots of Syrian refugees. This doesn't get talked about here in Washington because the Jordanian embassy has a very skilled PR operation. But the situation is a lot more dynamic than just we have a lot of refugees, therefore we're not getting aid. Jordan receives a lot of aid, and the problem is way beyond just refugees or Palestine. It's about internal debt.
Okay, I have another question from Sami Tayyib. It's related to this. I think Aaron answered that partially, but let me address the balance of that question to Joe and to Imad. If that's the case, if he's right, and the Palestine issue, for example, is not the big issue, and the motivation is not this Kushner Greenblatt plan, why are the Gulf countries all of a sudden, scurrying to kind of try to help rescue Jordan from what he described as its internal predicament?
Well, there has been a lot of talk that this package that the Gulf countries put together in Mecca was not actually Gulf countries. It was only a Kuwaiti originally piece of assistance. Jordan directly asked Kuwait for assistance, and Kuwait provided $1 billion of assistance. And then when the story goes that when Saudi Arabia heard about this, they said, "Oh no, you can't be alone trying to help Jordan here. We want to be in on it." And thus the Saudi Arabia and the UAE got in on it. We also want to remember that the UAE, the strong man of the UAE, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, did not go to Mecca. Instead, the prime minister, the ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Mohammed Al Maktoum, who was the one who went to Mecca. So MBZ was not necessarily very keen on really assisting, specifically because Jordan remained, so to speak, on the sidelines regarding the GCC crisis. So now we also have to remember also that the Saudis and the Emiratis are pushing for whatever the Trump administration is trying to push for. And that is also burdening Jordanian foreign policy as well. So we don't know what transpired in Mecca. Obviously, this was all discussions behind closed doors, but who knows what King Abdullah would get from the meeting, whether he is going to allow certain things or not allow certain other things. We really don't know.
You don't have to answer this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. In terms of how certain things, certain portfolios are handled in the Arab world, do you think the sheikh from the ruler of Dubai, the prime minister, was there because of intermarriage, because he's married to the king of Jordan's sister?
He probably would like him. He probably would like him not to get a heart attack because he doesn't want his sister to be widowed. But there is a much larger political
He
issue
seems
here.
to handle that issue every time there is a crisis. All right, this one is for Joe from Teresa. Do you see the possibility of a default on Jordan's public debt? Is that a possibility?
No government default. I mean, they have to stay. They cannot close. We're closed as a country, and then we're going home. They cannot default. I mean, the issue is they're not gonna meet the benchmark. So the IMF benchmark gonna be delayed for a year or two, and then at some point, I think maybe the job of the next government after the results will come. Maybe they'll try to attempt another to raise revenue, but no government default. They just.
I don't know if this really has any bearing on this, but remember a few years back, well, probably 10, 12 years back, Argentina did that, right? Argentina defaulted on its foreign debt and said we're not paying anything, and they're still fine, they're still alive. Whether it is politically feasible for Jordan, that's a different story, but who knows?
Can I make a comment on that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Since 1991, Jordan has had 6, by my count, debt restructuring. Debt restructuring for governments is a polite term that's used for the...
Yeah, could you hold on for the microphone just a second? It's on its way. By the way, Hani Findakli has many years of experience at the World Bank, IMF, and finance, economics.
Thanks. For those who haven't heard, I said that Jordan has had experience with debt restructuring, which is short of default, but it's a polite term that's used for governments, equivalent of Chapter 11 for private sector. So Jordan has defaulted, in effect, 6 times, and it's been restructured 6 times, and it would not be surprising to me that it would happen again and again. And I think the fundamental issue that I think all of you had addressed tangentially is the economic model of Jordan. The economic model of Jordan does not work. It has been based on a lot of using its political and geographic position to gain economic benefits, whether it's from the region, from its neighbors, from subsidies, from aid, and from large foreign lenders. That structure is the one that's in need of complete overhaul. And until and unless that happens, we'll continue to have debt restructuring endured.
So I think one point that's really important to emphasize, during the protesters, a lot of them were angry at the IMF, at the World Bank, saying decisions in Washington, decisions in London shouldn't be controlling what's happening in Amman. But if that's the case, the painful measures that need to be taken to wean yourself off of foreign dependency, to wean yourself off of foreign aid, is what? Is cutting the public sector, reducing the public debt, increasing the tax base. But there are many of the protesters and Jordanians in general, whether it's because of the very important points that Mercer was saying that they're not getting very much in return, but a lot of people aren't willing to take that step. So they're against the IMF and others controlling Jordan's economy, which they really do at the end of the day. But in order to end that dependency, they're not willing to take the necessary steps to be independent. So that's really the catch-22 with the Jordanian protesters. It really hasn't been analyzed enough.
I mean, just to quickly add, 65% of the government of the public debt is domestic. It's not international as people think. So yes, we're not going to get to a point of default because the way is that restructuring is that will not allow Jordan to get to this point. Just to answer the question.
Okay, I did mention earlier the makeup of the new cabinet, including 7 women as ministers in the new Jordanian cabinet. The question from Meg Saunders is, do you believe that they will have a role to play as a bloc, in a way, in the new cabinet? Anybody would like to take a jab at that? It's addressed to all of you.
So I think there's a lot of focus on the different ministers, and it's definitely a good sign that there's 7 female ministers. It doesn't often happen in the Middle East. But I think if we're talking about gender equality, a much more troubling sign, and this is according to the Jordan Times, so you can't accuse me of being biased, 13% of women are economically active in Jordan. Just think about that, 13% of women. So when we talk, it could be even lower. So when we're talking about wasted economic resources, we're talking about expanding the tax base. There's so many different reasons for why this is the case, but this is one key recommendation that needs to be at the center of when we think about how to reform Jordan's economy. Because it's nice to have a figurehead, the Minister of Tourism or the Minister of Media Affairs, Jumanov, the head of Al-Ghad, is the new individual. But if we're going to talk about changing Jordan's economy, that is the area we need to be focusing on, not about the ministers.
All right, Warren David is saying that he's asking a rhetorical question. Am I missing something? You are. Is the prime minister really separate from the king? I mean, isn't he appointed by the king? Can he make major decisions without the approval of the king? I think you alluded to that in your remarks. You want to reconfirm that, or anybody else answer that?
Every prime minister in Jordan come in a certain task, in a certain definite period. Abdullah Mansour, I remember during the IMF event, he surprised everyone and he made a comment that IMF basically a group of economists that don't care about the development, which has shocked everyone at the IMF. It was all the paper all day. We had to manage the crisis the second day with all the officials. And it was a way, it signified that he was taking distance from the IMF. He came for a period where the Jordan didn't want to be too close to the IMF, didn't want to take a major decision in the crisis. Mulki came for a task that they want to try to push, that we have less foreign aid now, let's try to basically do some economic reforms. Now we're going into a new period where Omar is just trying to absorb the IMF demand, absorb the public anger, manage the crisis for a year or two until we get to 2019. I think this is the task of Razaz now, and it's a very difficult task.
Okay, last but not least, Bashar Aish addresses this question to Dr. Imad and myself. What is expected from Jordan when it comes to the deal of the century, with the expectations from Israel, Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia's crown prince, with regards to the plan? Would you like to begin that, or you want me to?
I want to defer to you on it, but I want to stick my finger in the pie here. To me, it's a very, very dangerous and fraught situation. The legitimacy of the Jordanian monarchy is in large part dependent upon what happens with Jerusalem. Remember, the Jordanian monarchy was the one that annexed the West Bank and gave it back up in '87. So why did it annex it originally? Because it really thought that maybe the Palestinian cause Palestine is gone, that's it, so we annex it. And in '87, there was hope that maybe the Palestinians can, first of all, King Hussein, may he rest in peace, wanted to just defray the cost of really managing the West Bank or paying for anything there. But yet at the same time, there was probably talk that maybe the upcoming talks at the time, remember, there was a whole lot of about the Reagan plan, the Fahd plan, the Madrid talks, all that stuff. Everybody was thinking that maybe something is going to be happening. Thus, the West Bank is ready for a Palestinian state. Now, I don't know how King Abdullah is going to be able to manage all this, considering that there is palpable pressure on him to try to deliver the Palestinians on this Jerusalem issue. And the pressure is not only America, but the pressure is also Saudi Arabians.
Let me just add a couple of things. Clearly, I think the mission of the team that's heading to the region, Kushner and Greenblatt, is to try to at least clarify with a little bit more detail than with what we have seen in the past, their plan, and dealing with these key actors that you mentioned in your question, Saudi Arabia and Emirates and Jordan. Try to clarify what is being asked in terms of support for this plan. Despite some of the denials, kind of wishy-washy denials by 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, I would say that there are two basic demands, and that's Jerusalem and refugees. The role of Jordan, as far as this plan is concerned, is crucial. They know it at the White House, that this plan is not going to see the light of day if Jordan doesn't acquiesce to Jerusalem and to the basically dropping the issues of the refugees from the negotiations, where it becomes an issue. It will still be discussed, but it will be an issue of settling the refugees where they are. So that's where Jordan's future is. If you settle all the refugees, the largest Palestinian refugee population outside of Palestine in Jordan, what are the national security implications of that for Jordan? The worry in Amman is that some of these other Arab countries that are working with the US, with the Trump administration on other issues, namely the issue of Iran, confronting Iran, they feel that these countries, their emphasis on Jordan, the importance of Jordan, the survival of Jordan, and the cause of Palestine is diminishing in return for American support on Iran, on the issue of Iran. So there is a quid pro quo that might derail, if you will, Jordanian national security. And when you begin to see, even though they were just hints from some Gulf leaders questioning Jordanian influence or the historical Jordanian, let's say, role or deference by Palestinians and other Arabs to Jordan with regards to holy places in Jerusalem, when that gets to be questioned by some Saudi individuals, and then some Jordanians retaliate by questioning Saudi sovereignty over holy places in Mecca, then we have an issue, a serious problem that is brewing. And to me, what's so important is the fact that the US seems to be, the Trump administration seems to be encouraging that without fully understanding the implications for all parties concerned and without fully appreciating the difficulties that implies for Jordan. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for being here. Hope to see you again in the future. Thank you.